going back to the church congregation in Bielefeld, which is one of those cities that are quite remarkable here for historians. Okay, let's talk about supply chains. Supply chains have once become a very important issue. They have not been really in the focus, but they have been rediscovered, as it may seem. They are more in the media focus. There's some reasons. There's some reasons that might be the pandemic with a big C, and it is about the economic consequences of the Russian war of aggression.
Der globalen
And this is a consequence of the global change, the global supply chain, and it has created some attention for the problems of the transnational connectivity in the production of goods. And this has been produced there where on the fields and in the groups where the economic and political actors did not really encounter that many problems apart from the political and criminal endeavors to look beyond human rights as far as the structural policy would really be coming to a save. And this morning we have heard about the topics and the differences between the Germans and the Anglo-American scientific culture, and this had made me thinking, and I have figured out that sometimes it is difficult to be not swimming along with the current movements in Germany, and although it is usually people who are wrong and not the discourse or the debate. And then indeed for those people who think differently and who think that as long as the global structural policy will rain riches on us, we will be affecting all. And I would like to cite one of those people, a sinologist, Markus Hernig. He was convinced that the new Silk Road project initiated by President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China, some might have heard about it, that this project of the new Silk Road would primarily bring prosperity as long as people remembered their German, or more precisely their Hanseatic roots, in order to, and I quote, "ride the Chinese dragon." After all, just like the Southern Silk Road, the Hanseatic League is a history of urban success only made in Germany. So this is how we can read it. This has been published by all the chambers of commerce of the nation and accompanied by our former Federal President, Mr. Wolf. 3.5 years later, we have all been on board, we've all been present, and the colleague Kene, something that we, very few times, we have been privileged enough to say that we have all been there, because our people are usually long gone. But 3.5 years, we're really all present when it comes to taking on responsibility. Vladimir Putin turned off the gas tap and impressively demonstrated the heedlessness that economic blockades can cause in countries that rely too much and too long on individual suppliers and supply routes. And we were part of the game. So this is how it can go. So if you were to go to the European Hanseatic Museum in Lübeck, and we can say so, this might be competition here to the German Historical Museum in Berlin, but I think we can doing that. So should you go to the European Hanseatic Museum in Lübeck, and you will see a large map in the room rouge, this depicting the raw materials like the one behind me, that came to the Flemish trading metropolis from halfway around the world in the Middle Ages, semi-finished and finished products that were exported from the whole world, so depicted with arrows. The entrance ticket triggers an impulse and everything suddenly goes black. What visitors are symbolizing here, that you become more aware, is the Great Trade Blockade, with which the Hanseatic League first took powerful action as the Deutsche Hanse. This is quite impactful, and I could talk half the day about it, because what we experience is a full-blown organization that all of a sudden appears. Of course, we had smaller elements and smaller ideas, but out of nothing, we have an institutionalized organization which does what? It triggers this trade blockade, and the Counts of Flanders no longer wanted to grant foreign merchants all their traditional privileges. The Germans practically paralyzed trade in Bruges. This was back in summer of 1358, and less than 2 years later, the powerful county of Flanders relented. For Hanseatic historians, over the last 150 years, this was the high point of Hanseatic glory. For those looking back, it was an oppressive example of the political power of trade, if you wish. So, going back to the sinologist Markus Hörnecke, this quite glorious but vulnerable metropolis, and I quote, the junior part of the Hanseatic League that had to follow its rules. So, historically speaking, this is nonsense. So, should you not look only on this individual outcome, but if it were true, and the parallel would be just a little less crude, then one would ask oneself, is this really something that we wanted to see today? Is the new Silk Road initiative really something that we want to see in Europe or in Germany? So, the answer or the response to that question is, and I do not only say that to you in my position as a scholar, but as a person, the answer, of course, is a lot more complex, and the answer is not part of this symposium, although you might feel that I would have one. But the question refers to a core problem of our new and modern world that we see as already completed in the northern world, but in recent times is reappearing with some dramaticism, because it shows us the boundaries of the free trade that can not always be regulated. So when we talk about the vulnerability of supply chains, once again, it is usually not so much a question of the dependence of civil society, but in supplies for basic needs of the industries producing food within a reasonably functioning, and of course we can discuss about it, the functional internal market, but we can talk about it later. We have only to watch to take our time into consideration. So it is not, and I want to underline it, about belligerent ideas, the proposition of the National Socialism, and it's not about the problems of political isolation, how the GDR tried to foster chicken production quite successfully. This is not what we talk about. This is about energy position, and to tackle the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. It's about high tech, the necessary resources that are not only of natural origin, but are now called critical resources. So we call about magnesium, about lithium, cobaltum, and you name it. But it is not, at least in the Federal Republic of Germany, it's not about the provision of basic needs. And although the noise of the federal farmers might have brought across a different idea, the self-sufficiency in our country is at 100% or even above. And not the last, and we have to admit it in a sense of fairness, that because of the noise of our farmers and the subsidies that have supported them for some time. In the pre-modern times, it was quite different. We heard it. And since the wave of urbanization and the explosion of the population in the 12th and 13th centuries have new regions have emerged, and not only because of the shiny metal or the nice cloth for the women were dependent on export. And those were the flourishing merchant trades in Flanders and the Netherlands. We were already talking about Bruges, and we had highly specialized areas like in the fishing areas in the Scandinavia. And this, of course, is the same today. We don't notice it as much, but last night during dinner, a young colleague told me how difficult it is to be able to buy some vegan sausage in Norway or some heat replacement products. And this, of course, makes us dependent on imports and exports. And this does exist as well in our new, beautiful world and our solid economies like it is Norway. But we are not in our modern economies, but we're right in the Middle Ages, and therefore we have to go back to the soil quality and the spatial distribution of this growing population that is taking place in the 12th and 13th century, because we do not have the necessary resources, and those communities and societies depend on imports. And this society has emerged from the scarcities of the Middle Ages. Over generations, a new generation is emerging to become a surplus generation, and the far distance trade does take on a very important role. But there was one problem, because ethically speaking, this long distance trade was not ethically justifiable. There was a problem because Christians were strictly forbidden from taking interest, and therefore also from charging a markup. So the deadly sin of avaritia, the greed lurked around every corner of everyday commercial life. And if you have been fascinated from the energy of my colleague this morning, I can tell you that there might be a book on it. So you might be interested in reading it. But in the middle of the 12th century, Petrus Lombardus, who might have been one of the most influential scholastic authors of the High Middle Ages, he taught that merchants and soldiers could not be admitted to the sacrament of penance. We have heard this morning, so if you only had to confess once a year, then you could say, so what, doesn't really make a big difference. But in a society where we respected the God above, it might in theory, be more difficult to not be accepted, so not be admitted to the sacrament of penance. And therefore, we have a broad spectrum of theories that in the course of the Great Commercial Revolution gripped Europe at the same time in the 12th and 13th century. So we had the clever theologians that arose from the innovative new mendicant orders who deliberately moved away from prayerful solitude, the vita contemplativa, to the sinful cities and became pastorally active in the vita activa. And those new theologians, those theoretics, they created a new consensus that made trade and profits from it possible. They rediscovered Aristotle. We were talking about him this morning already, but developed it further independently. Merchants, this is what it is argumented, provided a service to society, res publica, a utilitas, because they procured necessary things, it is necessaria, that were lacking in one place and could then be procured from another place. So they went to great lengths to do so. And last but not least, they also took a periculum, a risk, a danger. We could debate on the right translation. So they take a periculum because long-distance trade wasn't only far away and therefore not only dangerous, but it also took some extra time. And Therefore, in the course of the trade, circumstances can change, the demand can change, and therefore the prices. And for all that, the merchant takes the uncertainty of the future of society's shoulders and onto himself. In return, he earns recompensation, and that is why profits in long-distance trade are okay, at least within certain limits. To argue about those limits is the task of the new school of thought that we call business ethics, that emerges around that time and is still with us today. And then we have the bellum justum, the just war, which served a higher cause and was only waged by the relevant authority according to clear rules. And this was contrasted with the lucrum justum, the just profit, so to say. And so both warriors, or the soldiers, and the merchants were able to find their way to the kingdom of heaven. Under these conditions, from the turn of the 12th to the 13th century, the Hanseatic trade develops in Northern Europe as one of the most important economic bridges between London or Bruges in the industrially high developed West and the agrarian East. It is quite archaic. So we talk about those regions that had been just gradually Christianized by the sword, all the way to distant Novgorod, where the Hanseatic merchants operated their own branches, the so-called contours, the trading posts. Valuable furs came there, and amber from the beach of the Baltic Sea to the west, while sophisticated cloth industrial products came to the east. Above all, however, Hanseatic trade, in contrast to Southern European trade, was explicitly concerned with the necessities of life, as Michael Post noted it in the early 1950s, already some time ago. So this Hanseatic trade brings bulk goods from the large production centers to the trading metropolises, and these were not only ashes, wood, and wax, but also foodstuffs, grain, wine, salt, and talk about herring and stockfish. The Hanseatic League established the main supply chains of natural resources in Northern Europe by sea, and what we tend to forget, by land as well, by sand and sea. Now, the naturalness of natural resources is characterized by the fact that they occur naturally in some regions where they have their location and not in others. This was more self-evident in the Middle Ages than in the progress optimistic age of Enlightenment, where experiments were carried out with the mulberry trees for silk production, and what we have now heard in the Käfertal, that is a value that people look towards from all of Europe, because this is where rhubarb is grown. In the 70s, rhubarb was quite an important medicinal plant at that time, imported from Asia, and with a lot of effort and less so success was tried to settle down there. This does not mean that cultivated plants did not spread along the consumer and trade routes in the Middle Ages, so the Silk Road and Gale, for example. I don't know who is familiar with Gale. I don't think anybody uses it anymore, but Gale, that before hops was triumphant, was very important for the brewing industry. So Gale spreads from the coastal regions to the hinterland, even to Scandinavia, starting from the trading centers. And this is something that has helped the distribution of cultivated plants. But first and foremost, those agricultural markets were essentially dependent on local natural conditions until well into the 18th and 19th century. And not every natural resource could be produced in every location if enough effort was made. So this has been our mantra for some time. This idea is actually a specifically modern one. It was nurtured by the great chemical and biotechnological milestones of the 19th and 20th centuries, and then the Haber-Bosch procedure. So that promised a bread from the skies, we might say a fertilizer from the skies, and culminated in the self-sufficiency mania of the Nazi area that one would think that everything could be produced artificially or by chemically produced substitutes. And on the plus side, it has promoted many innovation and is likely to produce one or two now. The questions of dependency are becoming louder again. However, the principle that any good can be produced anywhere has its limit. If not natural ones, then at least economic ones. It is simply not worthwhile to tackle certain productions under poor local conditions. To put it positively, it is more profitable elsewhere, and this elsewhere then usually achieves a better price. In economics, this idea is known as comparative advantage, and it's usually associated with the English economist David Ricardo of late Enlightenment. At the beginning of the 19th century, he put this simplistic idea into a complex model. He said that every single country can produce every single produce that can be traded with the goods of other countries and is as important as the use of it. And back then, when Ricardo writes that economics did not have a name and was a subject of political science, half a century later, when Marxists and liberals alike discovered their interest in Ricardo, it was already called national economics and was much less obsessed with numbers than with history. It saw the free exchange of goods between states with different comparative advantages, not only as a regulating force of the market, but also as uniting nations. The fact that this also has its limits leads us back to the questions of economic power in the case of monopoly-like hegemonic positions on the market. As early as 1284, so 17 years before the Flanders blockade, a number of Danish kaploods from later Hanseatic cities successfully brought the Norwegian King Erich to his knees. And then I'd like to quote from this answer, so that "Nein konen og ederbrod og andre god mochte kommen." So no grain, no beer, no bread. The no beer was a big issue. As a result, they were so hungry that they had to go to atonement, to go to penance. So the Hanseatic League, which at the time was just emerging as a strangely fluid and yet very powerful alliance of Low German merchants with the backing of the cities, clearly demonstrated its power already in 1284. And it was only able to develop this because it assumed a desirable bridging function and exploited that function. Of course, market power also has its double edges and is not immune to fundamental upheavals. Quite successfully, the Hansen excluded their competitors from the fairs in what was then still the Danish Scania, where they bought herring for the whole of Europe. They displaced Dutch, and you can learn what this usually has as a consequence. They had no other choice than to build up their own herring industry in the North Sea, which ultimately became increasingly competitive with the expensive Baltic herring trade. All the more so when after 1500 the Baltic shoals disappeared for unknown reasons. The sea is just as dependent on nature as the agricultural sector on land. And here we can see when it comes to those supply chains that are highly monopolized, we are not devoid from those environmental upheavals. So finally, a question that has not yet been systematically addressed by Hanseatic historical research is the question about the consequences of extensive wholesale trade for the natural landscape. And this is something that we could be extremely interested in, the economic and ecological systems of the countries of origin where Hanseatic goods came from. In Central Eastern Europe, for example, the large-scale farms from which the grain for the markets of London, Flanders, and Holland came have shaped the landscape to this day. Then this is rather related to the 18th and 19th century, the younger goods along the river Elbe, but this is something that dates back a lot longer. In Scandinavia, on the other hand, the complained about the contribution of Hanseatic trade to the Norge-Nedgang. The Norway's decline is just as widespread as the Danish accusation of almost colonial Hanseatic practices, which is quite difficult to turn down. Both have been largely rejected from a trade history perspective, but have hardly been considered in terms of actual agricultural development. Studies on the effect of the Hanseatic timber trade on the Russian forests and on ash production are lacking, as are studies on the location factors and consequences of competition on the salt market. So all those big staple food products that are used in the new modern era. Numerous material and botanical factors that have not previously been the focus of Hanseatic economic history should also be included here. And it would be important to change perspectives that not only go to the intended trade directions to supposed to build bridges about the non-intended elements. Almost exactly 50 years ago, the World Food Conference in Rome, we have mentioned it already, in the face of targeted overproduction, Western industrialized countries, so over here, have addressed the influence of the energy markets. They coined the issue of wheat as a weapon. Less than 1 year ago, Ukrainian farmers and starving Mauritanians experienced firsthand what this meant in the face of Russian export restrictions. So 50 years ago, as well as 1 year ago, many might have forgotten these events. The Hanseatic League and its miraculous power to unite nations in the 14th and 15th century is something that we all too fondly remember. And best to remember both and might think about them differently here and there. Thank you so much for your attention.